Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston, and if this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear demos and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and production from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a home studio. If that's the kind of thing that could appeal to you, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button down below and stick around for future videos. Today we're taking a look at the Clean by Chase Bliss. So for me, Clean represents a couple of things here. One, it is emblematic of what I love about compression, and one of the reasons that I always seem so excited to talk about compression here on this channel. I am a self-avowed compression junkie. I have strong opinions on a lot of different flavors and implementations of compression, both for guitar pedals as well as in my DAW as hardware. I love compression. It's a weird thing to be a big fan of, but it is an essential building block of modern music and can be utilized in a lot of very creative and valuable ways. And Clean is a really great implementation of what compression is at its core in terms of the fundamentals, but also in terms of all of the ways that it can accentuate as opposed to just tame down and control. But secondarily, Clean also represents what I want to see from Chase Bliss moving forward. Chase Bliss has always been great at taking classic analog effects and imbuing them with creative motion, but Clean is a step forward in terms of taking that motion and marrying it to your actual playing and being something that is very responsive to the way that you write and the way that you perform. I want to see that implemented into more of their effects moving forward. But it's even more than that, because Clean also represents more flexibility in the format. I love all of my old school Chase Bliss pedals, but the one gripe I have with so many of their classic effects and a lot of their digital effects is a lack of headroom and having to do a lot of work to kind of implement these really cool and specific creative effects that I'm very reliant on in a lot of soundscaping and sound design into a studio workflow. Things that will clip if you give it too much input signal on an instrument level, have no hope of standing up in a line level environment with a lot of effectiveness. Meanwhile, we are currently using this as my compressor. And that's for real. This is my condenser mic going into a 1073 style preamp, and we are then filtering it through Clean in real time so that you can hear that this thing actually takes a really healthy signal very, very effectively. And it's worth noting in all of this that Clean is not just a compressor on its own. And by that I mean, even aside from all the modulation stuff it does, this dynamics control begins as a compressor, but as you pass over that noon threshold, it moves from compression to limiting and hard limiting, and then a sag control that actually gets pretty insane. We're gonna go ahead and turn up my dry control on my vocal right now so that you can kind of hear as we start from this kind of very like uncompressed, subtle amounts of compression here. And you can see the lights start to kind of light up more as we bring in more compression. We start to get a more flattened out, a more obvious compressed sound on my vocal. We move into hard limiting, where we are now hearing a lot of compression on that vocal right there. And then we can move into sag, which really starts to like hammer down the dynamics of this compressor to really create creative applications for extreme compression. Let's go ahead and dial that back to something a little bit more manageable. And so in this video, we are going to showcase the different features of Clean in a lot of different environments, both familiar and unfamiliar to myself, as well as I think a lot of people in my audience. We're going to showcase Clean as we are right now on a microphone. We are also going to showcase it in a conventional mono guitar setup where we really walk through it as a compressor purely, like just get rid of all the extra motion and craziness. How does this do as a compressor on its own? We will then wire it up into a stereo environment to showcase how all of the added movement and creativity in this thing can function in a wide stereo environment for added kind of expression within the confines of the idea of compressor. And then we'll take a look at some of the hidden and secondary features, as well as some of those dip switches through the lens of Clean on a drum machine, in a sidechaining environment, and on bass guitar. And so I want to keep this section brief because we have a lot to get to, but I want to say a couple of kind of broad things about clean at the outset. One is that in a world of studio compressors and pedalboard compressors that seek to emulate classic studio units, this is not that kind of compressor in my opinion. This is not the kind of compressor that innately imbues your sound with the kind of vintage transformer saturation and color like you would get with an 1176 or an LA2A style compressor. This feels very much like a nice, transparent, until it's not, compressor that is meant to use an envelope follower and a compression threshold system to adapt your playing and to kind of raise and lower your dynamics without imbuing it with any more color than you intend for it to have. Secondly, I think that clean is a really great way of understanding how compression works on the fundamentals level, because there's so many added things in this pedal. You of course have the basics of a compressor, your dynamics, your sensitivity, your wet and your dry, your attack and your release, and then an EQ in the middle, which is not essential to a compressor, but is very, very commonly associated with a lot of more pedalboard friendly compressors in the industry. But you also have these added things like the physics knob, which adds inconsistency and malfunction to the compression ratio happening to your signal. And you have this mode underneath the EQ that will take your EQ sweep from a fixed position manual EQ to something that allows you to wobble your EQ from a center point or sweep it from a fixed position to the full frequency range. All of these things, including the movement controls in the dip switches, they're all the result of the building blocks of a compressor. Not just this compressor specifically, but the idea that you have a ratio that applies change to signal above a decibel threshold level with an attack and a release that controls the shape of that compression ratio being applied. All of those fundamentals, if you mapped all of those points on a graph, those are the building blocks of all of those pieces of movement in this pedal. And so we're going to set up the video like that. We are going to start by experiencing what clean is as a compressor on its own and trying to really unpack and demystify how compression works so that we can take those building blocks and apply them to all of these more esoteric, ambitious, and creative endeavors in this thing. Let's put this thing on a pedal board and listen to it in terms of the fundamental building blocks of compression. We're going to take a look at the relationship between the dynamics control and that sensitivity. We are going to play with the attack and the release and see how that shapes the sound of compression, as well as the relationship between wet and dry, not only for keeping a very natural sound when using more extreme amounts of compression, but also in terms of the wet knob's role as a makeup control for when compression is applied and brings down the peaks of your signal. So fortunately for those of us familiar with compressors, or those of us learning about compressors for the first time in this video, most of the controls on clean as they pertain to compression in the traditional sense are mostly labeled correctly. And by correctly, I mean in a way that kind of points to the terminology we usually use when it comes to compression. Things like our attack and our release controls would be called attack and release controls in most compressor environments, both in the studio and on your pedal board. Wet and dry, likewise, are going to be the same. It is the wet level or the compressed level, and the dry, which is the unaffected guitar passing through. The only two we really have to make concessions for in this video are going to be dynamics and sensitivity. Sensitivity is still pretty close to what you would consider to be like an industry standard term. It is effectively the threshold your signal needs to cross in order for compression to be kind of triggered on your wet signal. Typically, I would call that threshold. A lot of compressors go back and forth between sensitivity and threshold, but effectively, if you turn that knob down, the pedal is less sensitive, or it raises the threshold for the amount of volume needed to trigger compression in this device, whereas turning up sensitivity will lower the threshold, which will result in more audio passing through the pedal, crossing over the barrier for compression to be applied, which both results in compression being applied more frequently, but also more extreme compression, because as we have discussed, the further over the threshold the audio goes, the more compression is applied to it. Dynamics, by comparison, would normally be called something like ratio in a conventional compressor pedal. But in this context, the dynamics control does not just do compression, because clean is not just a compressor, even outside of all of the extra stuff stapled onto the sides. From minimum to noon, Dynamics will operate as a compressor, basically walking through compression ratios, starting at 1:1, moving up through 2:1, 4:1, 10:1, and then infinite to 1 at noon. But once you pass over that noon, you move into a limiter. Because once you've moved past that compression ratio algorithm and you move into limiting, you now have a maximum loudness available to you in the pedal. And rather than reducing volume over that threshold by a ratio, it instead just hard caps right there and gets squashed down to meet wherever you have set your ceiling. As you move through that limiting past noon on the knob, it is going to get progressively faster, snappier, and more aggressive, moving from a feedback algorithm to basically a feed forward system for quickly and aggressively clamping down on maximum volume in the pedal. Once you get past that limiting, the last 10% of that knob is going to move you into sag, where you kind of bypass the idea of hard limiting and instead get to a place that kind of reminds me more of failing tubes in a tube amplifier, where the harder you play in, the more the kind of overall tone of the amp drops out from under you. So now that we at least have kind of our basic understanding of what each knob does and what it represents, let's start to kind of walk through them, separated out into pairings that make sense. We are going to take dry out entirely for the start of these sound samples so you can really hear what the compressor is doing in this device. But what I want to do is start out with release at a medium setting, attack at a medium setting as well. EQ is going to be at noon for a full frequency response, so we are not filtering out any of our highs or lows. We're going to take our dynamics down to minimum, put our sensitivity somewhere that you can kind of hear our guitar moving through the pedal in a way that activates that compressor as noted by the light. And then we've got our wet volume at a place that will be slightly above unity so that it operates as kind of offering us some makeup gain as we hit compression. So before we engage it at all, let's go ahead and listen to our clean tone. This is a Lincoln Brewster signature Strat into a Benson Monarch. I'm going to try my best to kind of stick to some of that cleaner, softer dynamic playing for this video because I think it really helps accentuate, especially in these early settings, what I love about a good compressor so much. So as you can hear, we are not getting any real compression yet, and this is not lighting up because this is not just threshold crossing. This is a representation of how much compression is actually being applied to the signal. So that'll be the interplay between this dynamics knob and the sensitivity. So let's take dynamics up to something in the ballpark of like a 4 or an 8:1 compression ratio. And as you can already hear, we are kind of, as we dig in more, we are hitting that compressor more aggressively and starting to hear an audible amount of squish. Let's go ahead and max out that sensitivity so that we can hear like a really extreme amount of compression as we walk through these different compression ratios. So back down at 1:1, we're still not going to get much of anything because but right away you can literally hear the volume drop as we move into a ratio of 2:1. So as you can hear, we're now getting to a point where with that sensitivity set so high, where the threshold is so low, that we are getting a ton of compression above a pretty low volume limit. There's a good lesson about how to use compression in this exact moment too, because we are applying so much compression to such a low threshold. You actually end up in a position where really soft notes end up being much louder than really big notes, which is a method of misusing compression to get really unnatural results. So let's listen to like really barely there soft playing. And then a little bit of like actual chord playing underneath that. And so this is why it's so important to either have that dry there to kind of like re-bolster that if you want that really squished tight compression as an effect, or a good reason to go, if I want a really strong 10-to-1 or higher compression ratio, roll that threshold back so that we're hitting it less aggressively. And this is a good spot in this to kind of do a quick comparison with our dry tone to kind of showcase why good clean compression and even some somewhat aggressive clean compression can be really, really beneficial. Soft notes picked through chords can be a little bit more glued together, can bring out the kind of natural harmonics of your guitar more effectively with a little bit of compression. So like, there's a little bit of just subtle magic that comes out of having a really good compressor. And there just happens to be something that really works well with a neck pickup on a great Strat when it comes to compression. Let's go ahead and step up into that noon position, the most effective or most aggressive amount of compression before we step into limiting. This is definitely an area where being able to glue together your chords can be really, really beneficial if you want those kind of slightly more percussive, but you need it to kind of like stand up to it, to stand up straight in a mix. This kind of compression can also be really, really wonderful in a context like this to make single notes stand out strongly. Like we discussed earlier, there's this thing where if you overdo the compression, your single notes can be bigger than your chords, but somewhat aggressive compression with the right threshold that just kind of kisses it just so gives you these moments where your single notes can stand up strong next to the chords as kind of equals in a mix. And for a guitar like this that has really low action and is strung up with nines, which is not a very heavy set of strings for me, who usually plays 10.5s to 11s, the ability to kind of feel confident in those single notes is really, really useful. Let's go ahead and move into our limiter. And as you move through this, once again, you will get this area is also worth revisiting the sensitivity control, because the limiter is basically a hard cap to how much volume you can go past with your threshold. And it's no longer a ratio issue. It's now a fixed thing that is adhered to more or less aggressively by this limiter. And so if you take it back, if you take the limiter to kind of a slower position and take this sensitivity way up and it brings the threshold way down, you'll notice that it makes the overall pedal very quiet. See, because we're no longer working with a compression ratio and instead a hard fixed ceiling, even those quiet notes don't get the opportunity to peek through like they did with overly aggressive compression. Everything gets squashed. And so if you want to make use of that limiter, find the kind of sweet spot on that threshold. This is also a great spot to make that sensitivity a little bit more aggressive so you can hear the difference in how that limiter reacts through this section. Because obviously these are ratio differences, but over here it's going to be the snappiness of the limiter. So we're going to go to, we'll make it up with the wet so that we've got a little bit more volume on tap. So you can hear we come in strong and then it very kind of gradually gets like squished down to where the limiter wants us to be. And as we move through to a more snappy and aggressive version of that limiting, there's a reason that you're seeing these two images at either side of the dynamics control. It's because on this side, you are operating in compression where you have your quiets being brought up to meet your louds and your louds being brought up to meet your quiets. Over here, you are no longer bringing up those quiets. You are only smashing down the louds. And the reason that little tiny image right there is shaped the way it is because on either side of that crush, you do have unity gain, but you also have different shapes of how that kind of like is taken away and returns. let's go ahead and take a look at that sag. As you can hear, you can't hear anything. That sag, when set aggressively, will basically zero out everything with enough input signal being fed into it. And we'll get into some examples of why that might be really useful later. But for now, I will just say that because there are so many interesting other bits of movement that can be applied to this pedal, things like the wobbling and movement of the EQ, things like the attack and the release, kind of like being able to modulate the way that those dynamics are applied to your signal, and the very weird, very like aggressive weirdness that comes with those physics control. Something that brings that stuff out of your signal on purpose and intentionally with your envelope actually does have a lot of value. But for conventional compression use cases, you pretty much want to stay in the limiter back down through all of your compressors. So let's go ahead and take a look at the attack and release on this thing, which is basically going to be, we've established what that compressor sounds like, how the threshold is set with the sensitivity control, and how the compression is kind of force multiplied upon your signal using that dynamics control. Let's now talk about the speed at which it is applied and released. Attack is going to be the onset of that compression, basically how quickly, once you have passed your threshold, the compressor starts to reduce the maximum loudness of your signal, and the release is going to be how long it takes after you've crossed back below that sensitivity threshold for it to kind of like let go. Because it's worth noting that both the attack and the release only apply once you have crossed the threshold set by sensitivity. So a fast release isn't going to do anything if you are still playing above the threshold. You have to drop below so that the compressor wants to let go of your signal again, and then the release will be activated. So let's start with conventional wisdom for like funk guitar stuff. A really fast release and a really fast attack is going to be a mode of compression that onsets really quickly and lets go really quickly as well. This is the kind of compressor ratios. Obviously, we are setting our ratio too aggressively to make a point here, but these are the kind of like attack and release controls that you will often see utilized in like funk guitar and that kind of thing. Positions 2 and 4 in a Strat are great for these moments. Obviously, let's go ahead and set a slightly softer ratio and bring up our threshold a bit. So now we're just kind of like kissing it. Versus So that's going to be very fast attack and release. And you can hear those also really, really effectively if we go over to that really aggressive sag. Conversely, if we take our attack to its very, very slowest and our release to its very, very slowest, you get a much more gentle version of both of those things. And even though we've stopped playing, you can see how long it takes for that light to go away, and it's because the release on that is incredibly slow as well. Slow attack can be really, really useful for certain genre touch points, but one of the really big benefits to a slow attack, especially if you're using more aggressive compression ratios, is being able to kind of retain the transients on your pick attack. So this is great if you are using clean or a compressor in general on bass guitar, using a pick or using your fingers, and you want that kind of sound to come through, because an aggressive compressor will kind of take your guitar pick so like a fast compressor ratio will kind of try to like really quickly clamp down. And if you're playing through like slower notes, one, you can get some pumping effects when picking through chords. You get that kind of conventionally squashed sound, which is not necessarily genre appropriate for chiller moments. But by rolling that attack back, you can get some of that pick attack back, the transients of that initial hit, as well as by slowing down your release, you kind of do more to get rid of that pumping sound of the compressor letting go too quickly and bringing your tone rushing back. This can be really useful. Slow to medium attack and slow to medium release can be really useful for both conventional rock stuff as well as more soft, kind of dreamy ambient stuff. To put a finer point on this, let's go ahead and showcase how even without bringing in our dry, that kind of like well-tuned, well-set up, like medium attack, slow release on this thing can really bolster our guitar in an ambient environment where otherwise our guitar might get lost in the mix. So here we have the Chase Bliss Therme and the Chase Bliss CXM 1978 Reverb, and we're going to take those in conjunction and just kind of create some ambience. Let's get our guitar to stand up in that mix a little bit better. The other benefit in that context, especially in a kind of practical ambient context, is if you are playing like finger style chord progressions. It can do a lot to kind of bring some sparkle back to that, as well as being an effective way of smoothing out unintentional kind of pops and hits with your strings that, as we all know, can create pretty giant unwanted pillows of reverb that kind of sit above the gentle stuff we're playing. So yeah, there are a lot of specific genre touch points for those attack and releases, but it's important to know, generally speaking, that fast attack will do more to quickly apply compression, which has some benefits and some drawbacks, including whether or not you want your pick attack or the kind of like bite or the attack in general on whatever instrument you're using to get clamped down, or whether you want those transients to be able to sit out forward. In a mixing context, keeping your transients available and present in your mix before compression is applied can do a lot on drums and, like I said, on lead guitar parts to allow those moments to kind of punch through the mix in more aggressive ways. The compressor can be set up to bolster that sound, to keep the sustain and the body present of those notes, but sometimes you want to make sure that you're leaving space for the initial hit of a note to really be present, and that is what attack is for. Likewise, the release can be really, really useful for, especially on things like bass guitar, can be very useful for sustaining notes. If you're playing individual notes and you want the kind of like strength of that bottom end to kind of persist through. But likewise, if you have it set too long, for things like drums, you can find you're getting too much ringing out of a tom hit or something like that. So a lot of this stuff is genre and a lot of the stuff is to taste and conventional wisdom. And my recommendation is, as you sit down and play with this thing, find your use cases for attack and release on a use case by use case basis. And a compressor is a way that guitar players tend to artificially inflate the sustain of their instruments to great effect. However, long sustaining notes, especially with a lot of compression applied, can sound very flabby and can sometimes do unwanted harmonic content upon your amplifier, which is where this EQ comes in. This is a EQ that will carve your highs and your lows depending on which way you go with it, and can offer up kind of that smoothness and that richness of a compressor while also creating something warmer or with more sparkle depending on which way you go with it. So let's dial up a moderately aggressive compressor sound for fingerstyle, and then let's give it some additional sparkle by rolling out some low end. And likewise, you can also use it to warm up a sound as well. One of the best things about this compressor is the fact that EQ takes you all the way down to basically no audio passing through. And the reason that's beneficial is will be revealed to us when we get to this mode control in the middle, as well as the aux switch for auto swells, because you can basically use this thing as an amplitude auto swell, or my personal favorite thing in the entire world, a low pass filter auto swell. And this thing does that incredibly well. Let's say that we have this sound. We have we've carved out some low end because we want that clarity in our compression. I want that high compressor. I want a lot of sensitivity. But I also want to crank that attack. I want a lot of that squish. And I want a lot of that clarity. And the reason I want both of those things is because I am playing some two-hand tapping nonsense, and I am famously bad at two-hand tapping. So say we have this kind of thing going on. That doesn't have a lot of body to it, does it? You turn this on. So now we have all that clarity, we have all of that consistency with our two-hand tapping. Soft notes are being brought up and loud notes are being brought down so that everything feels intentional. But it also means that when we make the jump from those, there's no life left in our guitar. Bring in that dry tone. And now we have all of the dynamic presence, all of the kind of attack and pick attack and transients of our dry guitar. But we also are still getting our consistency with our compressor. So you take that out and you've got that really weak and anemic sounding picking or two-hand tapping. You bring this in. But you still have all of that dry tone to kind of bolster things. You take that wet out. And you get that consistency. This is my favorite thing about compressors like this, the ability to dial in a nice, snappy, aggressive compressor with a high ratio, a lot of attack, or like a fast attack, a long release. You can even do a short release, because if you take that dry out, you'll really hear. All the sustain, all the consistency, all of the presence. And you can also, like I said, get rid of your long release, but still keep some sense of consistency and natural decay with that dry control. Finding the kind of balance between how much dry you want and how much wet you want is a total preference-based endeavor. But also, not everything has to be super aggressive. You can go ahead and take that wet and still dial in like a pretty subtle version of compression. Slower attack, long release, not a lot of EQ, and just have that kind of conventional, subtle bit of like added body underneath. So like you take that wet out entirely. So now that we hopefully have an understanding of what compression is at the fundamentals, let's go ahead and see how Chase Bliss has taken these parameters, these controls, and this envelope system and used it to experiment with and expand out a bunch of other creative endeavors, as well as applied it to a wide stereo spectrum. We are going to wire clean back up into a new pedal board in stereo. We're going to give it a listen with a very clean stereo amp afterwards, as well as stereo wet effects beforehand. This will be where we take a look at some of those auto swell functionalities, the EQ movements, as well as some additional kind of really interesting and creative expressions of that envelope system. So we've rewired the board up with clean going into So we've rewired the board up with the Chase Bliss Brothers, the Mood going from mono to stereo, the clean and full stereo, and the Universal Audio Enigmatic as our amplifier now. We also have a drum machine set up on the board, which we'll use for sidechaining later on. And I am now playing my Ernie Ball Music Man, Saint of Vincent. Here is a quick revisiting of our clean tone. So yeah, we're taking a very, very clean approach to our amp here, which will be handy for some of the stuff that we're going to get into, especially with Mood ahead of it. So let's start by digging into the envelope follower side of things. Obviously, like we said, it's how compression works in general in a device like this, but we can also apply it to things like our EQ and additional ways that the compressor interacts with our signal and with the outgoing audio. As we discussed, when the mode switch is in center for EQ, it is a static and kind of like manually controlled equalizer. Going counterclockwise rolls off highs, going clockwise rolls off lows. But that EQ can also be modulated in really interesting ways. By going to the left, you go into shifty mode, which is a EQ mode where anytime you pass your threshold, the EQ will basically sweep from its current position to the center point of it, basically to full frequency, which essentially allows you to do EQ-based swells either from a low pass or a high pass perspective. And then on the other side, you have modulated, which the attack control will basically set the speed of modulation, and wherever you have that EQ set, it will basically modulate around that point. Let's start by showcasing the shifty mode on the left. We're going to go ahead and take our dynamics completely out, but we are going to turn our sensitivity up. And as we discussed earlier, by taking that EQ all the way down, we basically kill our signal completely. But by turning on shifty mode, and obviously the attack and release are going to control the speed at which that envelope is kind of applied. And that sensitivity control is going to be triggers both of those, as we have discussed earlier. The fundamentals of that sensitivity, attack, and release are all intertwined. And so if you have your sensitivity really, really high with a really fast attack and release, you will hold on to those notes before closing that EQ back up much more quickly until we cross below our threshold. But if you make it less sensitive, it will be harder to open it in the first place, and it'll be much more likely to reclose. And for context, I am holding out those chords like this. Increasing sensitivity will increase the likelihood that it will open, and the amount of time that my audio passing through it will keep it open. Likewise, you can keep that sensitivity somewhere in that range, go to slow attack and release times, and you will get a much more gradual build up of audio, but you will also get a much more gradual closing, which means if you're trying to do kind of more manual volume swells, like, you're going to have a harder time getting them to kind of re-trigger the way that you want them to. But in this context, I find it's valuable to take the sensitivity higher and lower that threshold, because the amount of time it's going to take for a really long attack to fully open your filter back up, you're going to start losing steam on your guitar. And so you want it to be above that threshold long enough to get to a full frequency range. And likewise, you can also have that come in from above. It can also be used not as a complete swell function, but instead just a method for creating a little bit more dynamic in your playing, where you have a like low passed kind of warm guitar that will open up further as you play. So Shifty basically just moves the EQ based on the attack and release as long as you're above your sensitivity threshold. Conversely, modulated is going to basically set a speed of modulation with the attack that will basically modulate around a center point as defined by your EQ's current position. As long as you're above the threshold. And the nice thing is it's not hard on or off. You still have a fading in, a speeding up of that modulation as you kind of cross over that threshold. those are the 3 EQ modes in clean. Let's go ahead and take a look at the physics control. So the physics control basically destabilizes the envelope follower, the dynamic response of the pedal. You kind of play into it. It determines kind of your playing dynamics using that envelope follower, which is then how you control the actual dynamic response or the first stage of compression in clean. And so you can sabotage that, as the manual would say. And effectively what that means is a little bit inscrutable, but left position is going to be a more measured and more predictable response to your playing dynamics with less dramatic shifts and kind of alterations. And the right position is going to be your more kind of unstable, intentionally broken, obviously like malformed version of compression. So stable, responsive, accurately following your playing dynamics. I'm going to set a fast attack and release to really accentuate and exaggerate these sounds. As you cross over that threshold, you get very consistent pulsing, something that kind of feels intentional. The right side, not at all. So it's at this point that we're going to go into dip switches as well as hidden and alternate controls, because this is the part where you start taking everything that we have on the face and really applying some really wild stuff to it. One of the final things on the face of the pedal that will directly coincide with kind of digging into the top row of dip switches up above is going to be this aux control over here, which can be a manual swell by pressing and holding and releasing to open the envelope, or you can have it set as an auto swell basically by pressing and holding until it turns green, or what we are going to do, which is use the dip switch for latching, and so that we can basically touch it once and have it just turn green and be an auto swell. So we are still in compressor mode right now, as you can hear. But by pressing on that aux switch, it now turns green, and we have by taking your dynamics to 0, you are not doing any compression, and this is only functioning as an auto swell, which is really cool. So yeah, that is a really effective tool for auto swells, early in chain, late in chain. This is a very, very cool thing to have on your board, either compressed for more sustain in those swells or uncompressed, and just using this straight up as like a really accurate transient-free auto sweller for your pedal board. You can also combine that EQ opening with that swell, which is also really interesting. Yeah, it's pretty rad, but we can start to do more because this is stereo. And so you can take something like that auto swell function and turn on stereo spread and start doing some really interesting things with both the physics and the EQ as we're doing things like swelling and modulating parameters on this pedal. And this is just the auto swell still. Let's take that auto swell back out and instead apply that to our moving EQ. And suddenly we're applying movement through the signal, which also ties in really well with your dry, because now you can do stuff like dry guitar sits in the middle, and the compressor kind of swirls around, opening and closing that EQ. And then you can apply some additional nonsense with those physics controls. But if that kind of wonky sound is a little bit too much for you, there's actually a way to use hidden menu items. So basically press and hold both these buttons and then flick this physics switch to center, left, or right. In the center position, you are applying stereo spread to both the EQ movement as well as the volume movements. But by clicking it to the left, it only modulates the EQ through the stereo field. And on the right, it only modulates your volume changes. So basically, we can go ahead and now the physics are only being applied to the kind of movement of the volume. So what we can do is go ahead and kick that physics switch to the right and only modulate the volume while kind of relegating the EQ movement to being in the center. So right now you'll hear just a ton of movement on all sides, but now the EQ will stay centered in the middle. And if we want to apply that swell, take the swell out. You now have movement on just on the volume, but not on the EQ, and vice versa. So yeah, you have some routing to kind of keep yourself centered, which is quite nice. Let's go ahead and turn that stereo spread back off and take a look at Clean's ability to sidechain. So by flipping a dip switch up top for sidechain, we have it now set up where this external port right here, where you can send in a 3.5mm TS cable, will be what the pedal looks to for dynamic response, which means even with sensitivity at maximum right now, Clean is not listening to my guitar to take cues on compression. But if I start a drum machine, And all the same rules are being followed in this context. So basically, you have the volume of whatever external audio source you're sending, whether it's a drum machine or a bass guitar, if you're using this to kind of process drums or something like that. This is going to be kind of how sensitive it is, not just in terms of crossing the threshold to create that sidechaining compression, but also it is going, the further above the audio kind of like threshold here that the external device gives you, the more aggressively your compression is going to be applied. So you can basically use this pretty insensitively with like a low compression ratio and get a very subtle tremolo effect out of this. Let's speed up the tempo a little bit to give us something a little bit more. Or you can set it up so it's being very sensitive to that external source, and increase how much it's looking to reduce by. And of course, attack and release are going to be how quickly that threshold starts compressing again. And how quickly the compression kind of comes back out. This can kind of be thought of in reverse because you're not setting the attack and release of the signal you're hearing, you're setting the attack and release of your signal's ability to come back from this. Basically how quickly how quickly it leaves and how quickly it returns. A good rule of thumb is slower attack, a less dramatic effect, but a slower release can also mean less opportunity to get back up to full volume. And this can be really, really cool with something like the mood in front of it. And this can be really, really cool with something like the mood in front of it. Activate that drum machine. And it's important to remember all of the controls, all of the features in clean are all still operating. They're just listening to a different audio source now. So you can do things like or turn that stereo spread back on. And it can also be set really subtly like it is right now, where if we take the external source out, we are just getting a very straightforward and they can reintroduce that slightly rhythmic pulsing to the entire piece. So we've come a long way since the noisy origins of this channel in badly maintained home studios under power lines and next to washers and dryers. But in an effort to highlight the noise gate effectively, what I've gone ahead and done is grabbed my noisiest guitar, my Squier Jazzmaster with P90s in it, and we're going to turn on 2 fuzz pedals in the Brothers stacked into each other to try to really lean into something worth noise flooring out. I think we've got it. And one of the nice things about compression is you can put it after overdrives to add sustain to notes for big solos and that kind of thing. Yeah, compression after drive can be really great, but that noise floor can also be something that people do not necessarily want to contend with very heavily. So let's go ahead and engage our noise gate and then make some hidden control adjustments to get it exactly where we need it to be. So you can hear that duck out a little bit if we take one of those fuzzes out. We now have a noise gate that will effectively filter out noise from the single coils into a fuzz pedal and come back in whenever we want it. And filters it back out, which is amazing. But say we want that truly knuckle-breaking double fuzz action. Obviously, the gate is no longer contending with what we are attempting to put into this pedal. If I fully mute, like keep a hand on the guitar, it'll go away kind of. But hands off, and we are just dealing with too much noise. You have access to a gate release time for how quickly and smoothly that gate closes back up. And you have a threshold control for the gate to determine how much noise needs to move into the pedal before it thinks to open. And you want to be careful about this kind of thing because you can end up with very artificial sounding guitar passages if the gate is set too high, where notes will choke off before they're naturally done fading out. But you want something where it will keep that gate closed in normal contexts, like it is right now. But obviously, I touch the guitar and it reopens. So let's raise that threshold and reduce that sensitivity. So we've now raised it so much that I can't actually get my guitar to open it as I'm playing right now. And conversely, we can have that release faster or slower. If you feel like you've gotten lost with all this, you can either do the kind of global hidden reset or consult the manual for the kind of default settings for all this stuff. For the threshold and the release, the gates are the release by default is noon, and the sensitivity is going to be at about 9 o'clock. Perfect. Yet another way to add more motion and dynamic interest to the clean is by flipping the motion switch on the top. Obviously, you're getting very dynamic dependent movements in the physics control designed to feel more like inconsistency and failure of the compressor circuit. And then you can also get movement out of your EQ control. But if you want something that sits much more in the vein of like a straight up compressor, there is a dip switch up top for movement, wherein the dynamics becomes the depth of motion, the attack becomes the speed, of course, and the sensitivity is going to basically be the threshold that determines how far all of that goes. So again, we are looking at all the same fundamental building blocks being explored in various different ways, different consequences of the information that envelope follower is taking in the first place. So let's go ahead and turn on motion. And of course, this can also make use of that spread control. And that's motion. There's a couple things left in the hidden features section that will allow us to further customize the different parameters and behaviors of clean as a compressor in general. You have, of course, a very fluid attack time right here with an attack speed that ranges from 0.5 milliseconds up to 300 milliseconds. And that release control is obviously preset to 3 different speeds, being fast, medium, and slow. But that release is preset with 3 positions, fast being 50 milliseconds and slow on the right side being 1.5 seconds. But that middle position that we keep going to as a kind of default actually can be set for its own custom release speed. By default, that release is going to be 650 milliseconds, but it can go anywhere from that 50 to that 1.5 seconds. And so you can kind of create your own custom attack and release speeds if you want to. So of course, once again, the kind of like middle position like this is going to be the middle position on here by default. So if you want to get back to the kind of like stock factory release time, you can either set that attack back to noon with those 2 switches held, or you can do the kind of classic flip this guy 3 times and get back to neutral. When it comes to studio compression, there's kind of 2 main ways of setting attack and release. There are analog attack and release controls like we're using here, where you set the millisecond rate on the attack and the release of your compressor, and they are exactly how the audio is treated as it passes over that threshold. That is by default how Clean operates. But there's also an adaptive mode in Clean where an attack and release are basically the minimum speeds possible for your attack and release controls, and the pedal will listen to your playing dynamics and adjust above those minimum speeds accordingly. This can be useful for faster, more dynamic and aggressive playing where you really want the energy of your playing to come through, but it also can result in a slightly more evident amount of compression, a less natural feeling form of compression. This is not super dissimilar from maybe program-dependent compression algorithms, but it's also not going to be a one-to-one to something like a program-dependent system like you would see in the Bondi Squish-Az or in like a Fairchild 670 rack studio compressor. You can switch between those or access a combination version that kind of gives you the responsiveness of the adaptive with the kind of like relative accuracy of analog by switching between the hidden functions in that release control right there. So let's go ahead and set a kind of aggressive level of compression and then move between those 3 things to hear how much we can actually hear it in this context. I mean, you can hear right away, like we have a medium release speed and we have a pretty fast attack on our guitar right now. And that adaptive mode is speeding up to match our playing really quickly. Go back to analog and just kind of like see how quickly that like lets go. Let's go to a medium release. Let's set that to a slightly faster medium release. But then if you kind of like strum the guitar quickly, you can see that pulsating light stays consistent every time. The onset and the release of compression does not adjust to the way I am hitting the guitar. Jumping over to adaptive. One of the benefits of adaptive is it gives us the ability to slow down our attack and our release with the knowledge that clean will speed up when we need it to. So like for nice gentle stuff, you get that kind of like nice gentle version. But it slows down to meet you a little bit. So there's a use case there. And like I said, it's just a little bit more. If your dynamics are going to be a little bit all over the place, adaptive can be nice. And here is the kind of like blended mode. You also have the ability to fine-tune that swell control separately from your attack and your release parameters by making adjustments on the wet and dry hidden controls for the swell. And again, by turning that volume or the sensitivity all the way up, you can stay above that threshold longer. But when you drop below it, it drops back off quickly. Be wary of really long envelope closing times because it means that even if you've stopped playing, that envelope is not reshut yet, so your playing dynamics can come through again. So as you've seen covered in a lot of other videos already on clean, that dusty dip switch can be a really effective way of turning clean into an overdrive for a guitar. And it can sound quite nice on guitar in a lot of applications. I would honestly recommend checking out Rhett Scholl's video on clean. If you haven't seen that one, that's a good example of how to get great overdrive sounds out of clean using that dusty dip switch. What we're going to do instead is pull in this drum machine. So we have a drum machine going right now, running stereo into the input on clean. And obviously you have access to all of the usual kind of dynamic control and EQ and everything else. As well as the ability to give it a little bit of compression to tighten things up. which can then be parallel mixed with your dry signal to keep that kind of like natural feeling of your drums going. Just for a little bit of like added weight. Or added snap. But let's say we want to go ahead and take better advantage of clean as a way to kind of add additional character to something like this drum machine. So let's go ahead and flip on that dusty dip switch. And now we are dealing with a kind of overdriven channel in clean on both the wet and the dry. So as you bring up that sensitivity, even with the dynamics taken out, and dry will overdrive as well in this context. Just in a different kind of way. And you can stack both for a lot of crunch. Dusty off. And dusty back on. Drummers, bass players, and anybody with a really strong working knowledge of studio compressors will know how important internal sidechained high-pass filtering is. In clean, you have underneath the EQ a secondary hidden control for what they call an envelope filter, but is effectively your internal sidechained high-pass filter. And what this is a non-audible amount of filtering that removes low end that hits the compressor threshold. And the purpose of this is low end has a lot more build up and energy than high end does when it comes to compressors. And so if you have a full frequency range hitting your compressor, like a drum kit or a bass guitar or a full mix even, the kick drum, the bass, the sub bass, all of that hits a compressor with a lot more energy and triggers a lot more compression than the high end does. This can result both in the high end getting lost in a mix. It can also result in kind of softer parts of your mix not getting treated with compression the way you would want it to, while kick drums smash that compressor every time, resulting in very uneven mixes or uneven bass performances even. So we're going to go ahead and play with that internal high pass filter on the sidechain for bass guitar to show how you can dial in a bass tone that has presence and body and sustain in the high notes without muddying up or over compressing your low notes. And for these sound samples, we are running my bass directly into clean and then directly into the Warm Audio WA-MPX tube preamp. So we're using no additional processing or compression or amp simulation whatsoever. This is just bass into compressor into a preamp. Kill our pick attack, and I wanted enough release that we get a little bit of added sustain to individual notes. But you'll notice our sensitivity is set so that our high notes don't resonate very effectively, whereas our low notes hit a little bit harder. So in order for us to get it so that we are getting a little bit of added energy out of those highs, we're now overly compressing those low notes. They're feeling flabby by comparison. So let's go ahead and filter out some of those low notes hitting the compressor itself, or hitting the threshold itself. And let's take it even more extreme. And by comparison, if we roll it back now, we are getting consistent response, the consistent amount of compression delivered across our high and low registers evenly, which allows us to, like I said, push compression a little bit more, bring in that dry signal to kind of like reintroduce some kind of like natural feeling to our bass tone. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I know this was a bit of a climb. I would love to know what you think of this. Have you bought a compressor before? Is this going to be your first one? If so, good luck, but also I don't think it's that complicated of a compressor, and I hope that we establish that over the course of this video. I would love to know what you thought of clean of this video. Once again, I hope you hit the subscribe button and stick around for more videos, and I will see you in the next one.